A throne, a crown, a scepter. They're the symbols of every king. But for the man who dared to challenge the very foundations of a kingdom, his coronation would be a grotesque mockery. His throne wasn't made of gold. It was a searing hot iron chair, forged to cook the flesh from his bones. His crown wasn't encrusted with jewels. It was a circlet of white-hot metal, lowered onto his head to burn its way to the skull. This is the story of a man who was supposed to be a hero, who became a rebel and was executed as a king in the most horrifying way you can imagine. This is the story of György Dózsa. So, how does a man end up in a situation like that? To get it, we need to rewind the clock to the Kingdom of Hungary in the early 1500s. On the surface, Hungary looked like a major power in Central Europe. But underneath all the royal courts and fancy knights, the kingdom was a powder keg just waiting to explode. You had two completely different worlds living side by side, the world of the nobles and the world of the peasants. For the lords and the gentry, life was great. It was all privilege, power, and land. They held huge estates, had their own private armies, and basically answered to nobody, not even the king. Royal power had gotten incredibly weak under King Vladislaus II, which left the nobles free to do whatever they wanted. And what they wanted was to tighten their grip on the peasants who worked their land. For the peasants, or serfs, life was just a miserable cycle of back-breaking labor and crushing debt. Imagine waking up before sunrise, not to work your own land, but the Lord's. Imagine most of the food you grow going not to your family, but to his table. On top of that, you paid insane taxes, and you were forbidden from moving or looking for a better life. You were legally tied to the soil, basically an asset, no different from the barn animals. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of people. This feudal system was meant to keep order, but in Hungary it had become predatory. Landlords wanted to cash in on rising food prices across Europe, so they squeezed their peasants harder than ever. What was supposed to be a deal, work for protection, had turned into pure exploitation. The nobles just took and took until the peasants had almost nothing left. This desperation created a deep, simmering rage that was spreading across the Hungarian plains. The people weren't just poor. They were trapped and they knew it. All they needed was a leader and a cause. And in 1514, the Pope himself would accidentally give them both. Way over in Rome, Pope Leo X had a big problem. The Ottoman Empire was creeping further and further into Europe. So, on April 16, 1514, he issued a papal bull calling for a holy crusade to push the Turks back. In Hungary, the job of putting this army together fell to the most powerful church official in the kingdom, Cardinal Tamás Bakocs. To get recruits, Bakocs sent Franciscan friars, who were popular with the common folk, out to the villages. They preached a powerful message: join the crusade, and you'll not only serve God, but you'll be freed from your duties to your Lord. For the peasants of Hungary, this was a divine opportunity. It was a chance to escape a life of servitude, not by breaking the law, but by answering the highest call of their faith. And they answered. Tens of thousands of them. Peasants, students, even local priests flocked to the recruitment camps, fired up with a mix of religious faith and a desperate hope for a new life. An army of commoners, around 40,000 strong, started to come together. But this army of crusaders, known as the Kuruc, needed a general. The man they picked was György Dózsa. Dózsa wasn't a peasant, he was a szekely from a group of frontier warriors in Transylvania and a minor noble himself. More importantly, he was a professional soldier, a cavalry captain who was already famous for his bravery fighting the Ottomans. In one duel, he'd personally taken down a famous Ottoman champion, Ali of Epirus. Dózsa was the real deal, a hardened, respected warrior, the perfect guy to lead a holy war. He was a hero. But as Dózsa started training his huge, messy army of volunteers, a new problem started brewing. The Hungarian nobles looked at this peasant army not with pride, but with pure terror. They saw thousands of their workers abandoning the fields right at harvest time. They saw an armed mob filled with dangerous ideas about freedom. To the lords, this wasn't a crusade. It was a direct threat to the social order that made them rich and powerful. And their reaction was about to turn a holy war into a civil war. The nobles moved fast to sabotage the crusade. They ordered the peasants to get back to the fields and collect the harvest. When the peasants refused, the lords hit back, and they hit back hard. They started harassing the families the men had left behind. They sent their own soldiers to attack the crusader camps. The message was loud and clear. You belong to us, and you don't have the right to leave, not even for God. This was the spark that lit the whole thing off. The peasants felt completely betrayed. They believed the nobles weren't just oppressing them, but were now actively working against the defense of Christianity. The Crusade's whole mission began to change. The enemy wasn't just the Ottomans anymore. It was the lord in his castle down the road. Facing total chaos and pressure from the nobles, King Vladislaus officially cancelled the crusade on May 23, 1514, and ordered the army to go home. It was way too late. The tens of thousands of men under Dózsa's command saw this as just one more betrayal. They refused. The holy war against the infidel was over. A new, much more personal war was about to begin, a war of extermination against the Hungarian nobility. At first, Dózsa himself was hesitant. He was a soldier, loyal to the king. But seeing the fury of his men and the treachery of the nobles, he finally gave in and embraced his new role. He was no longer a crusader. He was the leader of a full-blown peasant revolution. He sent proclamations across Hungary, calling on all peasants to rise up. His message was brutal. Kill the nobles, burn their estates, and take back the freedom you are owed. The rebellion exploded. Fueled by years of rage, peasant armies unleashed a storm of violence. They burned hundreds of manor houses and castles to the ground. They hunted down and murdered thousands of nobles, often with horrific cruelty like impalement and crucifixion, using the same brutality they themselves had suffered. Under Dózsa's leadership, the rebellion actually started to look like a real army. He captured the fortresses of Arad, Lipa, and Vilagos, seized their cannons, and started training gunners. One of his armies got to within 15 miles of the capital, Buda. Dózsa had become the master of the Hungarian plains. The nobles, who had laughed at the peasant rabble, were now panicking. The man they'd scorned was about to bring their whole world crashing down. As the summer of 1514 dragged on, the rebellion hit its peak. Dózsa's war wasn't just about getting old rights back anymore. It was about completely overturning society. The rebels declared they would abolish the nobility and end the oppression of the common man. This wasn't just a revolt. It was a war on the very idea of feudalism. The violence got more and more extreme. After taking the city of Shanad, Dózsa made a statement by impaling the local bishop and the castle commander. At Arad, the kingdom's lord treasurer was captured and tortured to death. These acts sent a shockwave of terror through the ruling class. The rebels were systematically eliminating the symbols of their power. But this wasn't a one-sided slaughter. When nobles managed to capture rebels, they fought back with just as much savagery, if not more. Both sides were locked in a death spiral of atrocities. The rebellion had become a brutal, chaotic mess where mercy was a foreign concept. So, was György Dózsa a freedom fighter, a righteous hero of the oppressed? Or had he become the monster the nobility always claimed he was? The truth is probably somewhere in the murky middle. He was a soldier who got thrown into leading a social explosion. He may have tried to keep things in line, but the pure rage of his followers was like a force of nature, impossible to completely control. The turning point came at the city of Timisvar, today Timișoara, in Romania. It was a key fortress, and Dózsa besieged it with his main army. But while Dózsa's forces were huge, they were still mostly peasants armed with farming tools. They were about to face a professional army led by one of the most powerful and ruthless men in Hungary, John Zápolya, the governor of Transylvania. Alarmed by the rebellion, the nobles had called him in. Zápolya had a well-equipped army of mercenaries and heavy cavalry. He marched to Temesvár, and the final showdown was set. On July 15, 1514, the two armies clashed outside the city walls. It was a complete disaster for the peasant army. Dózsa's men, mostly infantry with little armor, stood no chance against John Zápolya's heavily armored knights. The knights crashed into the peasant lines and scattered them. The rebellion, which had seemed unstoppable just weeks earlier, was crushed in a single battle. In the aftermath, György Dózsa was captured. His dream of a new world died in the blood-soaked fields of Temesvár. For John Zápolya, this was a massive win that made him a hero to the nobles. But for Dózsa and the other captured rebels, their fate was sealed. The nobility had been terrified and humiliated. Now they were going to get a revenge so theatrical and so cruel that it would be remembered for centuries. The goal wasn't just to kill Dózsa, it was to make an example of him, to create a punishment that would serve as a permanent warning to any peasant who ever dreamed of defying their master. They decided to punish him as a failed king. They would give him the coronation he supposedly wanted, a coronation from hell, a public spectacle designed to mock his ambition and terrorize anyone who watched. On July 20th, 1514, György Dózsa was led into a public square. There, his captors had prepared a smoldering iron throne, heated by a fire until it glowed a malevolent red. Stripped naked, Dózsa was forced onto it. As his flesh sizzled and burned, the spectacle wasn't over. They brought out a matching iron crown, heated until it was white-hot, and placed it on his head. They forced a heated iron scepter into his hand. Dózsa, the king of the peasants, was now crowned and enthroned in fire, his ambition literally turned into an instrument of torture. But the horror still wasn't over. This was psychological warfare. As Dózsa was being roasted alive, 9 of his fellow rebels, who had been starved for days, were brought before him. Executioners took hot pliers, tore pieces of flesh from Dózsa's burning body, and ordered the starving men to eat it. At the front of the line was Dózsa's own younger brother, György. In the middle of his agony, Dózsa begged them to spare his brother's life. They ignored him. György was cut into 3 pieces right in front of him. The remaining rebels were given a choice: eat the flesh of your commander or your next. Those who refused were killed on the spot. The others, driven by terror and starvation, did as they were told. They were forced to commit an act of cannibalism, to symbolically devour their own revolution. György Dózsa eventually died from the ordeal. His body was then quartered, and the pieces were sent to be displayed on the gates of Hungary's major cities. It was the nobility's final, brutal message. This is what happens when you rise up. This is the fate of a peasant king. The crackdown that followed was just as brutal as Dózsa's execution. Across Hungary, an estimated 70,000 peasants were tortured and killed. But the nobles' revenge wasn't just written in blood, it was written into law. The Hungarian Diet of 1514 passed new laws that formalized the peasants' subjugation. They condemned the entire peasant class to real and perpetual servitude, legally binding them and their descendants to the land forever. Their last few rights, like being able to move, were stripped away. They were forbidden from owning weapons and hit with heavy new taxes. The revolt, which began as a fight for freedom, ended up locking serfdom into place for generations. This had disastrous consequences for the whole kingdom. The brutal suppression shattered any hope of national unity. Just 12 years later, in 1526, when the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent invaded, Hungary was a broken, divided country. The peasants, who'd been crushed and disarmed, had no love for the nobles who had enslaved them and had little desire to fight for them. This internal weakness was a key reason for the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Mohacs, a loss that led to centuries of Ottoman and Austrian domination. So what is the legacy of György Dózsa? For centuries, he was officially remembered as a monster, a byword for chaos. But among the common people, a different story was told, the story of a martyr for justice. Over time, his image began to change. He became a folk hero, a symbol of fighting back against oppression. By the 19th and 20th centuries, revolutionaries and writers saw him as a proto-nationalist hero. During the communist era, he was celebrated as a working-class revolutionary. Today, streets, squares, and a metro station in Budapest are named after him. The man executed as a mock king is now honored by the nation. The story of György Dózsa is a brutal reminder of the incredible cruelty humans are capable of, both in the name of rebellion and in the name of order. He was a soldier who became the unlikely leader of a desperate cause, whose quest for a holy war morphed into a revolution, and whose horrifying death became a dark and enduring symbol in the long, bloody struggle for freedom. If you want to learn more about the dramatic and often brutal stories that have shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more historical tragedies.